All right, we're good to go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to probably the least breaking breaker talk, because this is more about building everything around the breaking processes. My talk today is called Modernizing the Application Penetration, Engagement, and Reporting Lifecycle. So this is kind of looking at things from a business and process point of view, surrounding everything that's not directly testing, but everything that supports it. For a bit of background, I'm from Canada. I come from a place confusingly called London, where my company is headquartered. I work at an offensive security consultancy, Digital Boundary Group, and I started there about 8 years ago as an application security tester and specialist. And for the past few years, I've also managed our application security team. We do almost strictly application security testing. This is my team here, of course. With a special thanks to James, who was a co-op who worked with us, and in particular, he contributed to some of the projects I'm going to be talking about today. So probably if you do offensive security, if you do penetration testing, you're not starting fresh, right? You don't just open up a blank Word document and write my first penetration test report and get started. And that was the case for me because when I first started, I started with Digital Boundary Group, and they had existing reporting tooling and processes in place. And as an actor in the system, I find that there are two things that are quite challenging to do. One is understanding everything holistically from a business process point of view. These processes are really information processing systems, so there is an inherent data flow and sequence of processing steps that underlies the system. But secondarily, I think it's very challenging to evaluate our own systems and challenge our assumptions about how they should operate. And so this talk is fundamentally about those two challenges applied to everything around application security testing. And so when I talk about the engagement lifecycle, this is what I'm referring to. Sorry, the text is maybe a little bit small, so I'll talk through the sections here. So an engagement doesn't begin when you sit down and start testing an application. An engagement begins at the scoping process, or if you're working in sales, it begins even before then, right? But from a tester's point of view, your engagement in the lifecycle begins at scoping. You engage with the client to understand what their needs are, what is going to be in scope, what you're going to test, what the requirements are. And from our point of view, that then leads eventually, once that's sold and there's a contract, to an intake where we have certain processes to vet the information that's provided to us to make sure we're testing the right thing, that we are familiar with all of the restrictions and requirements of that engagement. Then we have the testing and reporting process. Finally, that leads to a review process, to delivery, and finally, all of the various post-delivery tasks. So the motivation for this talk is ultimately about optimizing and enhancing everything surrounding the engagement lifecycle. So all of those steps along the lifetime of an engagement. And I think a really great place to start is to share with you all of the pains that we've experienced at our organization with what I'm calling our legacy engagement lifecycle. All of the things that really suck that have motivated me to try and improve things. And I will just go through the entire engagement lifecycle, so starting with scoping. So as I mentioned, our process starts with scoping. And so with scoping, we have a questionnaire traditionally that we send out to our clients or prospective clients saying, tell us the details of your application. We'll try to understand what the effort is going to be. We'll try to think about possible issues that we might run into. And so we have a checklist for that. So this is our first checklist that we're going to introduce. It's in Excel, obviously. We have an Excel checklist that now a tester, an application security subject matter expert will fill out, trying to determine, how much effort is this going to take? Do we have the right information? Are there maybe weird quirks about this assessment that we need to be aware of? And in a lot of situations, this also leads to a call, right? The information is not good. It's not adequate. We need to have a call with the clients. So actually, with a lot of customers, we just start straight up first with a call. We don't even ask them to fill anything out because we're probably not going to get all the information that we need. So the testers are also taking, they're producing testing notes and other information that is maybe free form relating to, how this engagement should go. And eventually, when as our offering, and our testing evolved, and as our clients evolved too, right, as they developed more mature application security processes, they started to have different needs and requirements, right? They were building their own ecosystem for how they were handling reports and testing results. And so they had specific requirements, both in terms of scope, in terms of what types of tests we were applying, like our methodology, how we deliver reports to them. And so we created a new document. And now this was part of the scoping process, where if there are special requirements, now a tester has to go and fill out all these requirements. And this goes into a Word document, and eventually that ends up in a folder. And you hope that everyone is putting down accurate information into those documents and into that folder. And you hope that the testers who are eventually assigned that are validating that information. Because we also get information elsewhere. Once an engagement starts, then we have our intake document. This is the document that goes out to the client and says, okay, we have a contract, we have a scope of work, we've determined what we're testing, hopefully, and how much effort it's going to take. Now you need to give us the details. We need to know what systems we're interacting with. And there are some kind of enterprise clients that we work with who have really robust and mature processes around this, where at time of scoping, they're like, here are your targets, here are your API endpoints, and so on. They give really detailed information. But the reality is, we still are talking with a lot of clients who they're kind of like, they're talking to us, they're scoping engagements before they've even finished developing anything. And so we don't know what systems necessarily are going to be in scope. We don't know what API endpoints. We don't have all that information ahead of time. So we have another document, we send it to them, the intake, we say, fill this information, give us the roles that we're going to use to test and so on, which ideally should have been agreed upon during the scoping process. And so that's another document that comes in, and because it often contains errors because it's filled out by people who aren't necessarily familiar with the original scope, maybe they're not referring to it, maybe they don't even work on the application team and they're filling this out because they're the CISO or something. And so there are lots of mistakes. So we have another process, which is another checklist, and this is the intake review. So now we have a tester who's an application security specialist, a subject matter expert, and they come in and they look at the scoping information and they look at what was provided on the intake, and they're trying to validate, like, is all of this information good? Does it make sense, right? Sometimes you can look at something and you're like, this doesn't make sense. Like, the asset they've sent to us, they don't even own, obviously. It doesn't make sense with respect to like the functionality that we thought we were going to be testing. It's crazy like how many issues arise at this stage, and that's why obviously we have now another process for this. And so it's another manual process. The tester goes through it and they're vetting the information, and you hope that they're paying close attention to the checklist, which is challenging to do because the checklist is tedious. Every checklist is tedious and every checklist is general, right? Because you have to account for all of the possible things that can go wrong. Some of the things might not even be possible to go wrong depending on the nature of the engagement. And so they're filling this out. You hope that they flag the right issues. You hope that they save the results into the appropriate folder for that engagement. And then finally, if everything checks out, maybe it requires some back and forth with the customer, but eventually we get to a place where we have an understanding, a shared understanding between us, between the whoever scoped it, with the customer. We get to testing. And that introduces new checklists. We're very heavily embedded into the Excel checklists. It's not as bad as it looks. There's a little bit of dynamicism built into, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we have, this isn't even it. This isn't even all of them. But these are a couple of our prominent checklists where we've decided to divide them into like a process checklist and kind of like a finding checklist, right? So the idea behind these, of course, is that we're doing everything that we ought to be doing during any given engagement, that we're making sure that our reports and our testing are consistent. I would say that it's especially useful for less experienced, like more junior testers who aren't familiar totally with all the kind of suite of tests and processes that they must go through. Like, for me personally, it's basically an exercise in like tedium, right? Like I get to this, I'm like, I wrote a lot of this at this point. So I'm going through it, I'm like, check, 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 check. It's painful, And yeah, a big reason, again, is that it's very general, right? It's a kind of a catch-all to provide like complete guidance. And I mentioned it's not very dynamic, but we do actually have some supporting VBA in here. So we do have some filters for different processes, for different checks, depending on the client, depending on the service offering, because we have different types of engagements, even within the application security team, right? There are different types of applications that we might see. So and there are different types of like scoped engagements that we offer, different depths of level of methodology. And so we have some filters that we can pre-apply, but even then, like there's so much more that we can do, but the complexity becomes, not necessarily unmanageable, but it's not the right way to do it. It's a huge mess. No one wants to maintain Visual Basic. Like, no one wants to do it. It sucks. And that's not even talking about reporting. So I hear this from pretty much everyone I talk to, and they're like, hey, what are you using for reporting? I say, oh, well, we're using Word. And they're like, oh, no, Word? That's awful. It was especially hard, when we were recruiting, right, trying to grow our team. And it's a common question. What are you using to report? Because people have had painful experiences with reporting software, and I say Word. And of course, I'm very careful, right? I say Word, but, because it's not that bad, the way that we use it. And I'll show you how it works. But it still has many, many limitations, which obviously is a big motivation for this talk. So the way that we work with Word is by extending its capabilities in a way that makes sense for us. So there are two primary tools that we use for that. One is custom VBA macros, yet again with a custom ribbon that supports like styling and formatting. And we can also use this to build like finding summary tables. So it'll parse through the findings. As you can probably imagine, that is a nightmare also to like build and maintain, because Word is not designed for you to necessarily parse through content like that. We also can use it to produce like CSV exports from the reports, which are a nightmare, but they do work in some narrow cases, which is nice. So we can, under the right conditions, take a Word document and run our macro, and it'll produce a CSV export for our clients who require it. And oftentimes it requires manual modification, because doing a little bit of manual extra work has become the easier path than going and making sure that our macros cover every possible like structure of the content within the report, especially as our requirements for different clients have changed. Like, we have different templates, we have different ways in which we approach reporting. But then we have another tool called Smart Docs, and so this is a commercial tool. It's like a plugin or extension for Word. It gives us yet another custom ribbon, and this is, I think, what really gives us substantial capabilities beyond vanilla Word, especially when it comes to content management and interaction. So a big part of what makes reporting really efficient for anyone who does it, at least approaching some level of efficiency, is having a nice database of content, right? Especially if you're reporting certain findings, right? There's information that is going to be repeated. So we use Smart Docs to connect to a SharePoint repository, and that stores all of our template content, and we use that to, we use Smart Docs to interface with it, to manage it, and also to drop in findings as we need them. And this is kind of what it looks like. If you open up one of our template reports and you get started, there are some variables built in, so that's functionality from Smart Docs where we can use variables, and then we can use wizards that you can see on the right to have the tester copy information. So there are all these additional manual steps, even though we already have the information, right? We know what we're going to be targeting, but now the tester must go and copy that information and make sure they copy it correctly into the report. They use the wizards to do it, so it makes it a little bit more efficient than like copying it across the report, and it goes into variables, so it's repeatable and referenceable. But it's still a pain, and you can also see that there are all of these highlights, and these highlights are for, this isn't even the start of all the highlights in our documents. But these specific highlights that you see here under our implications area relate to specific findings, right? Things that we could do. And in theory, you could have findings that we report that map to specific wording around like high-level implications, top findings, and recommendations. But we really can't do that with our system. And so the way it works is we have this green text, or this green highlighted text that acts as guidance, and we have yellow highlighted text that acts as basically conditional content. So there is, even with all of our automation, even with the tooling that we use, yes, it's still a pain to report in Word with our templates because of the various directions that it could go in. And so there are efforts in manually unhighlighting, manually deleting things. It's a pain, obviously. In order to take findings, so let's say you're looking for something related to session management, you use the Smart Docs Finder. Again, this connects to a SharePoint repo. It searches across all of our findings based on title and keywords. So that's just an example of what you could search, and you find the finding that you want, you drop it into the report. Like, it's pretty seamless. Like, it's easy enough. This is the one thing that makes it like manageable, right? It makes it not a complete like effort and futility in reporting in Word. It's this connection here and this capability. And I am actually really proud of our template content. It's one thing that I think that we've really done well. We actually have over 400 template findings that are generally really well written and structured. It's just unfortunate because they're stored by Smart Docs in this SharePoint list. And there are many different components or attributes of different findings, but they're not stored natively with data types that make sense. They're stored as attachments. Those are Word documents. So we have different sections in our findings, which I'll be going over in a moment, which you'll see with an example, but they're just straight up Word docs, right? And this is what an example, kind of like older finding of ours looked like. So the findings as well, they have some level of guidance on reporting and maybe some testing guidance as well, and they also have highlights for different situations. So if this is a very basic finding, like you're using a jQuery version and it's out of date, it's got vulnerabilities reported against it. There's some highlights to select, depending on which version that you find, and there's some empty space to report some, the affected systems and like what path you found it at and so on. And all of this stuff, so I'd like to call out the references section, because the references section, you can see there are just a couple of references here. There's a reference to the OWASP ASVS, and there's also a reference to the OWASP Top 10. So those standards change. Those are not, those standards are not going to stay the same forever. And so just one of the many tasks that's a huge headache with this system that we have is going through all these findings and updating them. You'd think that a system like this might have some capability to search through all of your findings and just do like a map, like replace all. That we do not have that. If you want to update all of these, you have to basically download all of these Word documents, what are referred to as snippets, and you have to change those all manually and then like bulk save them. Is like the best capability that we can get away with to do that is just having all the documents in one file and doing a bulk save after we've made the changes, maybe with like a match and replace or something. It's chaos. It's terrible. So this is where we're coming from. And once a report is completed, of course, that is a static document. So the report gets completed, there's the Word documents, a PDF is probably being produced because that's typically what we deliver to clients still in most cases. And that's all getting stored in the test folder with a lot of the other documents from earlier in the engagement lifecycle. Then we have more checklists because we have a review process, right? So the tester leaves the appropriate documents in the test folder, and then we have reviewers come in, and they're like, okay, we need to get the latest version of the report. We need to look at the checklist to validate those. They're opening up documents. They're creating new documents. They're going through the checklist, and there are a few other processes that I'm going to skip there. We can't cover them all, but like it's painful, right? And it's taking all of these static documents and storing them in a folder that eventually is going to be archived and basically like disappear, right? And there's more, there are more things that occur beyond the end of the engagement that still concern like the nature of that engagement and the results of it. And I'll just give you one very simple example. Like, we have many large and enterprise customers, and this is a great example because of how painful it is. And they want to have some idea of, like, at a high level, what their test results are like, right? They want to know, what issues are persistent across their applications. They want to know, like, what the kind of collective risk across their applications are. And we don't have, like, an analytics process for this. The process is I go into all of these folders and I take the PDFs out and I'm counting things. And I'm counting things and I'm classifying them, and it sucks. So problems? Yes, there are many problems. There are many manual processes. It's very inefficient, and whenever you have manual processes, not only is it inefficient, but it's very prone to error. Even if it's something as simple as like copying and pasting, like copying and pasting is prone to error. People just like go blank when they're doing it. You got a lot to copy, like huge source of error. As I mentioned, there's no like central data collection. We have all these static documents that are being, that are separate documents, and a lot of them contain basically the same information that's repeated multiple times, and they go into the folder, they're archived. There's a lot of metadata and information surrounding our engagements that's not just like the specific finding information that is worth keeping and centralizing, but we don't have anything that does that. The reporting process is, of course, inflexible and inefficient. I don't think I need to share all the reasons why. Content management nightmares, of course, and a lot of the tooling that we're using is, I would call effectively end of life, or at least seemingly not really maintained. And there are more sources of error. So I mentioned manual copying, multiple sources of the same data, right? This can lead to data inconsistency problems. You have different sources of truth. The tedious checklists, not only do they take effort, but they also result in compliance issues. I just told you I don't comply with my own checklists because I find them tedious, because I've written most of them, and I know the content in there. Does it lead to errors? Maybe, but at very least, like if people aren't complying, that it leads to gaps in the information that's being stored, even if that information is ultimately archived anyways. There's lack of validation at key steps, and there's also a lot of unnecessary complexity. Like Word is not a purpose-built tool, right? Word has a lot of functionality. It can do a lot of things. Like, it's not a bad tool. It's just kind of bad for the way that we use it. And because of this, and because of like the code that we've built around it, the macros and everything else, it's very easy for especially a novice tester to start working with us, and like they delete something without thinking, like some key like bookmark that the code was depending on, and it breaks everything, and it's a nightmare. So the unnecessary complexity leads to errors. It's inefficient. Lack of flexibility being the big thing, right? As we've developed our program and as we've started working with more like enterprise customers, they tend to be developing very specific requirements in terms of reporting, and the effort to modify the structure of our reports is massive with the technology that we're using presently. I already mentioned, providing stats and insights is a painful process. Maintaining and modifying template content, the manual processes again. And so I mentioned the data because it's going to be a big part of our modernization. But there are certain things that we haven't even considered until recently that we just can't do. And I'll give you a very specific example because it was a problem that came up. I'm very skeptical of the value of DAST tools, especially in relation to their price. I have the immediate experience of doing tests and finding many issues and running a DAST tool and it finds nothing. And so when renewal comes around, I'm like, you guys are charging this much, like what's the evidence for your tool? And they're like, the vendors aren't doing it. They're not evaluating their tools. And at the same time, we do have testers who say, well, this one time it found this finding that wasn't found with another process. And also it might be helpful where we have novice testers who aren't very experienced as a kind of to catch those possible misses. It was just something where we completely lacked any measure, like any quantification. So we started a new process to keep track of which findings were identified by DAST tools compared to manual testing. But there was no system that we worked with that it made sense to integrate this to. So it was part of our modernization process, which I'll be talking about obviously shortly. So the first thing is reporting modernization, because everything really is centered around reporting. Like that's the final product, right? We want to put together a report with ease that we can deliver to our customers. And the first thing I started with was, not just thinking about the all of the processes and the technology, but there are a few things I really didn't like about our reporting that I'll talk about in a moment. And so my first step was to take a look at just what was out there, trying to understand how is the industry broadly reporting for application security engagements? How are they structuring the reports? What information are they including? What standards are they referencing? And so this was one of my references. Probably many of you have heard of this before. It's a GitHub repo of published penetration reports, and I went through and I filtered for application engagements, and I also searched for and found some independently of this repo. And what I've done is an analysis of these. So I've explored all of the various features, kind of from a very exploratory point of view, trying to understand, what are the key themes, what are the key things that are reported, what are the big differences across the field. And this isn't quite published. There's always more work than I think there's going to be in putting these together. But I have a newsletter, and if you're really interested in this type of analysis, I will be publishing it there. All of the insights that I've gained from this in rebuilding the structure of our report and how we approach reporting. I will share a couple of really key, quick conclusions. And the first is that application penetration reports vary substantially. They're so different, it's crazy. And I think probably a lot of this has to do with reporting coming from a background of network and infrastructure testing, right? That's the foundation for how reports are constructed. And then as application security testing teams evolved to okay, well, we need to add some more information, do things a little bit differently, and everyone kind of took their own approach. There's no standard for what should be in an application security report, how it should be structured, and so on. So a lot of this in the analysis, when that comes out, will be my opinion, but I think it's a good opinion. So this is our the old structure of our finding, and I think some of this is vestigial from non-application testing, because we were at our consultancy, we were initially a smaller team. Now we're a big team. There are 12 of us. That includes a co-op, but it's, I think, a relatively big application security testing team. But a couple of the sections here, just to give you one example, the observation and implication, this, we've always used this as template content, but it never makes sense because we also have a findings section, which is the specific detailed findings specific to that engagement. But it sounds like maybe observation should be that. It's very confusing. So just from a wording point of view, it's not very good. And there are also many things that I found that we were including in the findings section. It was basically our catch-all, right? All of the content, everything related to our findings was going in that findings section there, right? How did we find it? How can you reproduce it? What do we think the impact is? And so on. and it makes it very hard to parse out certain information. So this is just one example of a revised finding. There are a few things I'm not mentioning. There are also a few things that are missing in this one, but I wanted to call out a couple of things. One thing that we have been asked for, and I actually do like when I see it, is a specific steps to reproduce section, and it's tedious in a lot of cases to write something out separately. Usually when we were writing findings, we were writing it with enough technical detail that in theory everyone should be able to replicate who has some technical background. But even so, we were finding that clients were having difficulty understanding it in that way. So steps to reproduce is a new one. We changed all of the background information just to be a background section, just little things like that, making it more clear, I think is going to be a huge win in our reports being readable and understandable. A risk assessment was, I think, a really important section in our findings that we added as well, because oftentimes we're putting in justification around why we assigned a certain risk. I think that's an important thing to do, but it wasn't really categorized anywhere. But just having that little section there, I think, is super helpful to understand. Just quickly go to that and say, hey, why is this a high-risk finding? What is the justification for this? What were they able to do with it? So it's just captured there. And this report also lets us split out different standards that we reference, whether it's CWE, ASVS, top 10, or whatever else. So just little things like that. And then the next step was actually determining what are we going to use as a technology for our reporting, because we want to move away from Word. We want to abandon macros. We want to do something different. So we came up with a task force, and we sought out to evaluate all of the reporting platforms that exist on the market. And the way that we approached this was we tried to get as close as we could to each platform, ideally a demo in each case. In some cases, we had access. In some cases, we didn't. We just had a guided call with the vendors. And we developed a 12-question form relating to what we thought the key features would be for a reporting platform. And I think it's never going to be a perfect process, but I think we were pretty thorough in this approach. And so one thing that was very important to us was the capability for reviewing and collaboration, right? Technical reviews for us are so important, right? Not just to ensure the quality of our reports, but it's also one of the only mechanisms that testers have for feedback from other potentially more experienced testers. And so a platform that does that well and a platform that really facilitates collaboration was something that we look for among many other things, which I don't have the time to get into. If anyone's really interested, they can always ask me afterwards, of course. So we decided to go with PlexTrack. It made sense to us. It seemed like it suited our use cases more. There are other vendors out there, and PlexTrack might not be the right one for you. But for us, I'm happy so far. Obviously, there are many challenges that we were facing and limitations, but we pretty much always knew that that would be the case. And actually, is anyone a PlexTrack user or has used PlexTrack? All right, right on. Because one thing that's kind of missing, I think, is much of a community. And so here's another plug. I'm going to be producing some YouTube content around how we're using and integrating PlexTrack. And that is coming at a later date. We're also going to be developing a browser extension around automating certain things within the platform, unless they can build features for us that do those things. But we'll see. One of the things that we liked about PlexTrack was that it supported rich text using CK Editor as a primary editor. So it's a pretty easy to use editor, and it supports most of the capabilities that we need. One of the limitations, just one limitation in the platform, was that they didn't enable the capability to view the source of it, but CK Editor version 5 is really handy because there's an inspector. So if you're ever using CK Editor 5 or above, you can use their inspector tool to view the HTML that underlies it, which was very necessary for us because, as you'll see in a moment, our transition of our content led to many issues that we had to understand by looking at how the data was represented in CK Editor in PlexTrack. And there are a number of reasons why rich text or HTML was advantageous as well. In particular, it lets us manage our content independently of any platform. So the other thing, because of how painful it was for us to, and how painful it still is for us to migrate away from the systems that we're using now, we wanted to make sure that we were in a place where we weren't totally reliant on any one tool or vendor. So we like PlexTrack for now, but if anything changes down the line, it's not going to be as painful to transition. You recall that previously all of our template content has been stored in these Word docs in a SharePoint list. This is one of the big painful parts of this process. So the question is, how do we get this into PlexTrack, and also where do we Where do we store it, and how do we maintain this content? Well, we already had Microsoft 365 accounts and subscriptions, and so with this we had access to a large number of apps and capabilities. It made sense to adopt MS 365 into our Lifecycle as a result. And having worked with a number of these platforms now, I do actually really like the general structure and feature set. Unfortunately, when you dive deep enough into any of these apps or platforms, you inevitably quickly find out that there are bugs and unexpected limitations that Microsoft apparently had not considered or prioritized, which is unfortunate. So there are some challenges still. I may even make a YouTube series about all those issues at some point. Nevertheless, we chose to use another like SharePoint or Microsoft list to store our content. This time, however, not as like Word document attachments. And I'm actually quite happy with this choice. It's worked out very well so far. The platform provides a lot of great capabilities to describe and store objects with a wide range of data types, and it exposes a pretty good interface to interact with that data. And of course, it supports like rich text, right? So we can basically one-to-one import this into PlexTrack. The challenge was getting it into a format where we could do this. So thanks a lot to two of our team members who worked on that, Murat and James, undertook the process of developing the scripts to parse out all of the Word content from all of the sections, produce a CSV document, parse that so we could upload it to a Microsoft list, and then build the automation so that we could export that and then upload it into PlexTrack. So now we maintain all of our template content in this Microsoft list, and all we have to do is run the export, and we can upload a CSV that produces a database native to PlexTrack. It was an ordeal. And as I mentioned, it's one thing I really like about MS Lists is the flexibility of it, right? So before, we were maintaining template content that would be that just maps onto Word, right? It's all meant to be printable. Now we can track a lot of metadata related to findings, so we can do all kinds of interesting things. Just to give you one example, there's an attribute here, if you can't see it, called bug bounty eligibility, and there's another one that maybe is cut off. Oh yeah, approximate bounty. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we found, like for a lot of our findings, the average estimated payout from a bug bounty program? And if we're tracking that information, then we can look at what the cost of a report would be from a pen test compared to what it would be from a bug bounty program. And that's something that we can just track as we can provide averages, default numbers in our findings, and that's not something that's going to just be printed out into a Word document. That's something that's stored with the findings that we can use with another process to assess that. So that's reporting, and then the next step was everything around reporting. And this is an ongoing and have I said painful enough yet? This continues to be a painful process, but we're making a lot of progress. I'm really happy with how it's coming together, and I think it's going to be great. But it's looking at everything else surrounding the engagement lifecycle. How can we integrate it with these systems? How can we automate it to the extent possible? And so one of the first steps towards that was building a data model around it, looking at, as I mentioned, these business processes are ultimately about the flow and transformation of data through the system. So what are the objects that we need to represent? What is the data model that we can build? And so yet again, as I mentioned, we've adopted the Microsoft 365 and Power Platform for various purposes. So we deployed this data model for engagements into a Microsoft list, and that lets us track a large number of attributes, and we're using this not just for engagements, but for clients, for various other things. Obviously, our findings are in there. And now we can build dynamic interfaces that connect directly to this data. So going back to the scoping process, instead of those static documents that we had before, now we can have a form around the scoping. And we can build some level of dynamic content into this form so that it adjusts what fields you see depending on what type of engagement that you're scoping. It doesn't necessarily overload you with things to check off and go through. And this is only, right here, this is just in Microsoft Lists. You can build custom forms how you want them to some extent. Eventually, we're going to be deploying more Power Apps that give us a lot more customization capabilities. Unfortunately, we've hit a few limitations due to what I would call bugs in the Power App platform. But now we store all this data centrally against engagements, and that also gives us the capability to automate certain things. So this is a Power Automate flow or automation. So now previously, we had those documents, and even with those documents that were stored, the tester still had to take that information and make sure it was stored properly with our project management platform, which I haven't even talked about. But then also, they need to make sure that that information gets to the sales contact and that it's it's formulated, it's structured in a way that the sales contact can put together a scope of work or proposal document that goes out to the client. And before, that involved constructing an email. Or you take all the information you've already recorded into your static documents, you construct the email, dear sales contact, here is what I estimate the effort to be for this engagement, here are the things, the requirements for the customer, and so on. Now we can just have an automation. We've recorded that information. We know what attributes, what fields sales are going to need. You click the automation, and it sends that email automatically, and simultaneously, it sends a separate email to the project management platform with the information that is needed there. So one little thing that's automated, and one advantage of that automation, not just the efficiency, but now it's standardized. They get the same information every time. We can have a better proposal document template so that sales don't even need to think about it, because we don't want them thinking too much about the technical information. They take the technical information we provide and they put it into the template, and it goes to the client, and everyone is on the same page. Easy as that. And if you're curious, this is what it looks like. It's a low-code platform. It's not for everything, every purpose. But one thing that I really do like about the low-code platform is I think it's a lot more maintainable. So anyone can come into here and look at the email template and modify it. Right? That's how easy it is to use for the most part. So that's a big advantage of it. And we can also now finally track all kinds of engagement data that could be analyzed to help us better understand and improve our own processes, right? There's so much data around engagements that wasn't being tracked, things that we might want to know, things that we might want to understand, to know just little things like how accurate is our scoping process, right? There's some ways that we can infer that from the time that it actually takes an engagement, the time that's reported against it, but now we're collecting that information. We're getting that direct feedback from the tester, and it's stored centrally. All right. Now the challenges, of which, of course, there are many. I've already mentioned some of these. Regardless, if you're going through this type of transformation process, there are always going to be limitations and bugs, I think, regardless of the platform that you go to, and especially in trying to, we're not starting completely fresh, right? We have our own opinions. We have our way that we approach reporting and the engagement lifecycle and testing, and we're trying to fit that into different platforms that maybe are not perfectly designed for what we're trying to accomplish. So, we have to make some sacrifices, or we need to find some workarounds. It's very hard to undertake a project like this at a consultancy. That is one thing that I've learned very hard this year. And of course, projects like these, of course, they take much longer than you anticipate. But everyone's busy with billable work, and we don't really always have dedicated project time to do a consistent dedicated rollout of a project like this, especially when we're still learning, right? We're still learning about some of the limitations and challenges. And so it's very hard to do this type of transition without conflicting with billable work, with actual engagements. And part of this too is planning for fallbacks, right? We are not flipping a switch and moving from one system to another. We're trying to implement it in an iterative way so that we're slowly adopting better processes. And part of this is painful, because we're kind of in a middle ground where nothing's really improved, but now we're doing different things. And it's important also to plan for fallbacks, because some things won't work how you intend, and there also will be edge cases that cause issues that you hadn't considered. So being able to fall back to an old system or way of doing things, I think, is very important in these types of things. Obviously, with any transition to new processes and systems, there's a learning curve effect, right? So even if we deployed a better system that's more efficient, that is easier to use, it's not easier to use when you're already an expert working with the legacy system. And it's hard to capture these. If there's one thing that I wish we could magically do without having to figure out how to do, is actually have some metrics surrounding how effective the transition and the deployment of these things are. But it's ultimately, I think it's ultimately impossible without introducing too much additional baggage to understand how effective the transition is and how effective the new processes are. I think we ultimately have to get to a place where it's just, there's consensus, right? We send out a survey, hey, how do you feel at this point the new processes are? And hopefully the consensus is that it's all going great. And of course, as I mentioned, there are always unanticipated issues and challenges. So the next steps, I think, are fairly simple. We want to continue to consolidate our data management, consolidate our processes. We want to automate as many things as we can, right? Remove all of those manual steps, remove the burden from testers from having to manage those. And we want to keep iterating on those two things. And finally, I do want to evaluate things to an extent, right? So the best thing, the easiest, most approachable method I could think of is, as I mentioned, like a survey. Like send a survey out to all the users. Hey, we've transitioned, or hey, how's this new process? Hey, what are the issues that you're finding with so-and-so? I don't think there's a really solid, objective way to do this otherwise. And if you're working in a consultancy like this and doing a major overhaul of your processes, your testers are experts at your processes. They've probably done many, many engagements, and they know what they're like. And yeah, it'll take them time to adjust to a new system, but you'll probably get really good feedback from them. So definitely, I really like using surveys to get feedback from everyone who has to tolerate all of these changes. But they've already tolerated all of the painful legacy processes. And that's it. That's it for me. You can reach me by email if you're so inclined. As I mentioned, I've got a YouTube channel and a newsletter, and I'm also on LinkedIn where you can hit me up, which is where that QR code leads. Thanks, everyone.